Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in South Carolina history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time when you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of the day or night. It started with a simple announcement in the Charleston Mercury, a modest paragraph tucked between advertisements for tobacco and imported textiles. January 18th, 1823. Fire claims Willowbrook Estate. 8 souls perish. What should have been front-page news was deliberately minimized to a footnote in history. The investigation lasted less than a week. The blame fell on a house slave named Solomon. Case closed. Justice served through a hasty execution. But nothing about this story was as simple as those faded newspaper lines suggested. Records from 1823 show that Willowbrook was owned by Judge Thaddeus Blackwood, a man whose reputation in Charleston society was immaculate. His plantation produced some of the finest Sea Island cotton in the state, and his legal opinions were cited as far north as Boston. The Blackwood name commanded respect throughout the Carolinas. What wasn't mentioned in polite society was how the judge had acquired his fortune, or why servants rarely lasted more than 2 years in his household. According to parish records, on the night of January 15th, 1823, the judge was hosting 7 guests at Willowbrook. The gathering wasn't unusual. Blackwood frequently entertained fellow plantation owners, bankers, and political figures. What made this particular dinner notable was that all 8 men present shared business interests beyond their public ventures. The dinner was scheduled to conclude by 10 o'clock. None of the attendees ever left the property. Margaret Carlyle, the wife of one of the victims, provided testimony that was later removed from official records. My husband mentioned a secret meeting, something about protecting their interests. He said Judge Blackwood had found a solution to their problem. When asked what problem they faced, Mrs. Carlyle claimed ignorance. Her husband's diary, however, mentioned the Charleston affair repeatedly in entries leading up to that night. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, a stable boy from the neighboring Pembroke plantation noticed an unusual glow on the horizon. By the time help arrived, Willowbrook was engulfed in flames. The main doors were barred from the outside. Every window on the first floor had been nailed shut. According to the coroner's limited report, all 8 men died from smoke inhalation while seemingly gathered in the judge's study. The doors to the study were locked from the outside. Initial newspaper reports suggested an unfortunate accident, perhaps a candle left burning. 3 days later, authorities announced they had found their culprit. Solomon, a house slave of approximately 30 years of age, was arrested while attempting to board a northbound vessel at Charleston Harbor. He carried no possessions save for a sealed letter and a ring belonging to Judge Blackwood. Solomon never stood trial. He was hanged within 24 hours of his capture. The letter in Solomon's possession was logged into evidence, but mysteriously disappeared from county records by 1825. No copy exists in public archives. The ring was returned to Blackwood's sister, who reportedly had it melted down immediately. What happened at Willowbrook that night? The official narrative satisfied those who needed closure, but inconsistencies remained. Why were all 8 men found in a single room? How did the fire start in 4 separate locations simultaneously? And most troubling, why were there boot prints leading away from the mansion that matched the expensive leather footwear owned by Judge Blackwood himself? For decades, the story of Willowbrook faded into obscurity. The land remained unclaimed, the ruins untouched. Local residents avoided the property, claiming it felt wrong. Children were forbidden from playing near the old foundation. The Blackwood name gradually disappeared from Charleston society, despite the family's once considerable influence. In 1861, as South Carolina prepared for war, a survey team assessed abandoned properties for military use. Lieutenant Charles Woodbury documented the Willowbrook ruins. His report, filed with Confederate authorities but later recovered by Union forces, contains a curious notation. Foundation remains solid despite fire damage. Discovered substructure extending beneath main house. Not on original property plans. Recommend further investigation. No follow-up investigation was ever conducted. During Reconstruction, the property was purchased by a northern businessman named Edward Holloway. His intention to build a new home on the site was never realized. After spending one night in a temporary structure on the grounds, Holloway abandoned the project. He later told associates he'd heard voices arguing through the floorboards all night. The property changed hands 12 times between 1865 and 1900. No development was ever completed. In 1932, history professor Dr. Martin Abernathy from Clemson University became interested in the Willowbrook case. His research into antebellum Charleston led him to tax records that raised questions about Judge Blackwood's business dealings. According to Abernathy's notes, Blackwood and his associates had interests in ships that officially transported cotton to northern ports, but often returned with cargo unaccounted for in any manifest. Abernathy's research also uncovered a connection between all 8 men present at Willowbrook that night. They were investors in a shipping company that lost 3 vessels in 1822. Insurance claims were paid in full, despite rumors that the ships had been deliberately scuttled after unloading valuable cargo. The professor's request to excavate the Willowbrook site was denied by local authorities. In 1934, Abernathy published a paper suggesting that Solomon may have been a scapegoat for a crime he didn't commit. 3 weeks after publication, the professor's office at Clemson was broken into. His research notes were stolen. Abernathy abandoned his investigation shortly thereafter, accepting a position at a university in California. He never returned to South Carolina. The land where Willowbrook once stood was eventually purchased by the state in 1947. Plans to develop it into a public park were abandoned after 2 workers refused to continue clearing the overgrowth. One reportedly told his supervisor that he'd found a cellar entrance not shown on any blueprint. When they attempted to open it, both men described hearing what sounded like someone dragging heavy chains across the floor below. No formal report was filed. In 1953, during a particularly dry summer, a fire broke out in the woods surrounding the old Willowbrook site. After the flames were extinguished, survey teams discovered stone steps leading to what appeared to be a subterranean structure. County officials ordered the entrance sealed with concrete within 48 hours. No explanation was provided for this decision. No photographs or measurements were taken. What makes the Willowbrook case particularly disturbing is not just what happened that January night in 1823, but the systematic effort to erase it from historical record. Between 1825 and 1900, every official document related to Judge Blackwood or the fire was removed from Charleston County archives. Property records were altered, family histories were rewritten. If not for newspaper archives preserved in Philadelphia, which occasionally reference the case, one might believe Willowbrook never existed at all. In 1958, historian Rebecca Sullivan began researching slave narratives from coastal South Carolina. Among the accounts collected by WPA workers in the 1930s, she found an interview with Adeline Jackson, who claimed her grandmother had worked at a neighboring plantation to Willowbrook. According to this second-hand account, Solomon had been purchased by Judge Blackwood just 3 months before the fire. He had arrived from a plantation in Virginia, already bearing scars that suggested severe punishment. What Sullivan found most interesting was the grandmother's claim that Solomon was literate, highly unusual, and typically forbidden for enslaved individuals. More curious still was the assertion that Judge Blackwood had specifically requested a slave who could read and write. This detail contradicted everything known about Blackwood, who had publicly supported legislation making it illegal to teach slaves these skills. Sullivan's research led her to ship manifests from Virginia to Charleston in late 1822. She found record of a slave transfer that matched the timeline, but the documentation was unusual. The purchase price for Solomon was 10 times the standard rate, an astronomical sum that defied explanation. More troubling was a notation beside Solomon's name. As requested, subject meets all specifications. Responsibility transfers to buyer upon delivery. While examining land office records from 1823, Sullivan discovered a survey map of Willowbrook that predated the fire. Unlike later renderings of the property, this map showed a substantial structure beneath the main house, accessed through the wine cellar. The underground rooms extended well beyond the mansion's footprint. No purpose was indicated for this space. In 1862, during Union occupation of coastal South Carolina, a northern journalist named Frederick Olmsted visited Charleston to document the effects of war on the former Confederate stronghold. Among his papers, preserved at Boston University, is a curious interview with an elderly free black man identified only as Thomas. The man claimed to have been a craftsman who performed occasional work at Willowbrook before the fire. According to Thomas, Judge Blackwood had commissioned extensive renovations to the home's cellar in 1821. Workers were brought in from outside Charleston, none local. The project took 6 months, and upon completion, all workers were paid handsomely and sent away on ships bound for Caribbean ports. Thomas, who delivered materials but did not participate in the construction, described seeing rooms designed for holding people, but built in such a way that no sound would escape. What business would a respected judge have with such facilities? The answer may lie in another document Sullivan uncovered, a letter from Blackwood to a business associate in 1819, preserved in a private collection. In it, Blackwood expressed concern about the increasing restrictions on our primary import. He noted that alternative arrangements must be made and mentioned creating a secure waypoint on his property. Historians now believe that Judge Blackwood and his associates were engaged in illegal slave trading. The international slave trade had been abolished in 1808, but demand for enslaved labor remained high. Smuggling operations continued for decades, bringing captured Africans to American shores through increasingly elaborate networks. The Charleston affair, mentioned in the diary, likely referred to a smuggling operation that had attracted unwanted attention. Sullivan theorized that Willowbrook's subterranean structure served as a holding pen for illegally imported slaves. The proximity to waterways would have allowed for discreet transport from ships to the plantation, but this theory doesn't explain why Solomon would target his master and 7 others on that particular night. For that, Sullivan turned to parish death records from December 1822. 3 weeks before the Willowbrook fire, a slave woman named Esther died on Blackwood's plantation. The cause was listed as fever, but her body was buried quickly without the customary inspection by a doctor. According to Adeline Jackson's grandmother's account, Esther had been purchased alongside Solomon. They had arrived from Virginia together. Some accounts suggest they were siblings, though no documentation confirms this. Sullivan's theory, published in a 1963 historical journal but largely ignored, suggests that Solomon's actions were a response to Esther's treatment. Whatever happened to her in the weeks before her death may have driven Solomon to plan an elaborate revenge. This would explain why he targeted not just his master, but all the men associated with the operation. What Sullivan couldn't explain was how a single slave managed to trap 8 powerful men in a study, bar all exits from outside, and start multiple fires simultaneously. Even with the element of surprise, such an operation would be nearly impossible to execute alone. Her research stalled when access to certain private collections was suddenly revoked without explanation. In 1968, during construction of a highway near the former Willowbrook site, workers uncovered a mass grave containing approximately 40 individuals of African descent. Carbon dating placed the remains between 1820 and 1823. State officials quickly had the bodies removed and reinterred in an unmarked section of a public cemetery. The discovery was never reported in local newspapers. The archaeologist who briefly examined the remains noted something unusual in his report, which was filed but classified until 1992. Many of the skeletons showed signs of restraint, grooves in wrist and ankle bones, consistent with prolonged shackling. More disturbing were indications that these individuals had died of dehydration or starvation, not disease or physical trauma. The report concluded that they had likely been abandoned in a confined space and left to die. This discovery lends credence to Sullivan's theory about Willowbrook's true purpose. It suggests that at some point, possibly when the smuggling operation was threatened with exposure, Blackwood and his associates made the calculated decision to eliminate evidence by abandoning their human cargo in the subterranean chambers. The timing of these deaths, likely in late 1822 or early 1823, corresponds with the increased tension noted in the surviving diary fragments. What of Solomon? Historical records provide little information about the man blamed for the Willowbrook fire. We know he was literate, unusual for an enslaved person. We know he came from Virginia with a woman who may have been his sister. We know he carried Judge Blackwood's ring and a letter when he was captured. But his voice is absent from the narrative. His testimony, if ever recorded, was destroyed along with other inconvenient documents. The official story, that a disgruntled slave burned down his master's home in an act of rebellion, was convenient and plausible to white authorities. It reinforced existing fears and prejudices while providing a tidy resolution. Case closed, justice served through swift execution. The alternative, that 8 prominent men gathered to discuss their illegal operation and met with foul play, was unthinkable. Yet questions persist. The barred doors and nailed windows suggest planning and time that a single person would struggle to execute unnoticed. The location of the bodies in the judge's study behind a locked door implies the men were already confined when the fire began. And then there are those boot prints leading away from the mansion, expensive boots like those worn by Judge Blackwood himself. In 1965, a construction worker clearing land near the old Willowbrook site discovered a small tin box buried approximately 2 feet below ground. Inside was a journal written in a precise, educated hand. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1823, 2 weeks before the fire. The last was dated January 15th, the day of the dinner party. The journal was signed simply S. The construction worker, Joseph Miller, claimed he read portions of the journal before turning it over to his supervisor. According to Miller's later account, the journal described a plan to bring justice where the law would not. It mentioned a woman named Esther, who had suffered greatly at the hands of Judge Blackwood. It also referenced chambers of death beneath the main house, where those less fortunate than I met their end in darkness. The journal allegedly disappeared after being turned over to site management. Miller was dismissed from his position 2 days later. When he attempted to find work elsewhere in the county, he discovered that he had been blacklisted. In 1967, Miller left South Carolina permanently. His account of the journal's contents was recorded by a graduate student in 1979, though Academic publications refuse to cite the interview. If Miller's account is accurate, it suggests Solomon was indeed literate and had documented his intentions, but other aspects of the Willowbrook story remain unexplained. Parish records show that Judge Blackwood's body was never recovered from the fire. While this was attributed to the intensity of the blaze, it adds another layer of mystery. Did Blackwood perish that night, or did he somehow escape? The letter found in Solomon's possession at the time of his arrest might have answered these questions. Its disappearance from county records suggests it contained information someone wanted suppressed. The unusual circumstances of Solomon's capture, attempting to board a ship while carrying his master's ring, raise further questions. Was he fleeing after committing the crime, or was he following a predetermined plan? In 1860, a former slave from a neighboring plantation gave an account to a northern journalist that offered yet another perspective. According to this witness, Solomon had been seen in conversation with Judge Blackwood multiple times in the weeks leading up to the fire. These meetings took place away from the main house, often near the property boundaries. Such private interaction between a slave and master was highly unusual and suggested a relationship beyond the typical hierarchy. This account introduces the possibility that Solomon was not acting entirely of his own accord. Perhaps he was being used by Blackwood himself, possibly as part of a plan to eliminate business partners who had become liabilities. The judge's apparent death could have been staged, the fire set to destroy evidence of crimes more significant than a slave rebellion. Census records from 1830 show a man named Thaddeus Black, established residence in New Orleans. His stated occupation was merchant, and he claimed to have relocated from New York. Records indicate he arrived with substantial wealth and quickly integrated into local society. The physical description in Port records bears striking similarity to Judge Blackwood, though the age was listed as 12 years younger than Blackwood would have been. Could Blackwood have orchestrated his own disappearance, using Solomon as both accomplice and scapegoat? The theory seems far-fetched, until one considers the boot prints leading away from the mansion and the never-recovered body. The ring found in Solomon's possession may have been payment rather than theft. The mysterious letter might have contained instructions or perhaps evidence Solomon was keeping as insurance. This interpretation casts the Willowbrook fire not as a slave rebellion, but as an elaborate scheme to eliminate witnesses and escape justice. It would explain how doors were barred from outside and why all 8 men were found in a single locked room. It might also explain why Solomon, allegedly fleeing for his life, was so easily captured in Charleston Harbor rather than attempting to reach safety in the north via the established Underground Railroad. The historical record offers no definitive answers. Too many documents have been destroyed, too many voices silenced. What remains are fragments suggesting a tragedy more complex than initially reported. Whether Solomon acted alone in righteous vengeance, was manipulated by Blackwood for sinister purposes, or was part of a larger conspiracy, the outcome remains the same. 8 men died in a locked study, while a man named Solomon hanged for their murder. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Willowbrook case is how effectively it was erased from public consciousness. Despite the prominence of those who died, despite the dramatic circumstances of their deaths, the story received minimal attention and was quickly forgotten. This suggests not just local influence, but a coordinated effort to protect reputations and business interests that extended far beyond South Carolina. The site where Willowbrook once stood remains undeveloped to this day. Local residents avoid the area, though few could explain exactly why. The underground chambers, if they ever existed, have never been properly excavated. What secrets might still lie beneath the overgrown foundation, protected by nearly 2 centuries of deliberate obscurity? In 1954, a history teacher from Charleston attempted to organize a field trip to document the Willowbrook ruins. Permission was denied by county officials, citing safety concerns. When she persisted, questioning the decision, she was informed that her teaching contract might not be renewed if she continued pursuing the matter. She abandoned the project. This pattern of institutional resistance to investigation continued for decades. The story of Willowbrook and Solomon represents more than just an historical mystery. It demonstrates how power shapes narrative, how uncomfortable truths can be systematically removed from the record. It shows how justice can be perverted when those who control the institutions also control the story. And it reminds us that beneath the manicured lawns of antebellum mansions, darker foundations often lurked. What really happened on that January night in 1823? Did a literate slave named Solomon exact terrible vengeance for wrongs inflicted upon himself and others? Did Judge Blackwood engineer his own disappearance, sacrificing associates to protect himself? Or is there yet another explanation, buried alongside other inconvenient truths of the era? One final detail emerged in 1961, when an elderly woman named Catherine Pembroke donated her family papers to the University of South Carolina. Among them was a letter from her great-grandmother, dated January 18, 1823, 3 days after the fire. It contained a single sentence that historians have struggled to interpret. They say only 8 perished, but I counted 9 figures moving through the darkness, and the last wore the judge's face, but was not the judge at all. Some scholars suggest this cryptic line refers to someone impersonating Blackwood in the aftermath of the fire, supporting the theory that he escaped. Others interpret it more literally as a sighting of Blackwood's corpse being removed from the scene. The more superstitious residents of Charleston have their own explanations, speaking in hushed tones of a figure occasionally glimpsed near the old property line, always at night, always walking away from where the mansion once stood. The land remains vacant, the chambers unexplored, the truth buried beneath layers of intentional forgetting. Perhaps that is where some stories are meant to remain, not lost, but deliberately hidden. For in the case of Willowbrook, one must ask, who benefits from the silence? And what might we find if we finally choose to listen to the voices history tried so hard to erase? In 1964, Dr. Eleanor Hayes, an architectural historian specializing in plantation structures, gained rare permission to examine the ruins at Willowbrook. Her official purpose was to document foundation techniques used in early 19th century South Carolina estates. What she discovered instead were inconsistencies that contradicted every official blueprint of the property. The main structure appears to have been designed around the subterranean elements, not the other way around, she noted in her field journal. Support columns and load-bearing walls align perfectly with what appears to be a pre-existing underground structure. This observation challenged the accepted timeline that placed the underground chambers as a later addition commissioned by Judge Blackwood. Instead, it suggested the mansion was deliberately positioned to conceal something already there. Local geological surveys from 1815, before Willowbrook's construction, make no mention of natural caves or formations that could explain these underground spaces. Whatever existed beneath the ground was man-made, predating Blackwood's ownership of the land. Hayes theorized that the property may have been selected specifically for this feature, though she could offer no explanation for its original purpose. Hayes attempted to access county records regarding the property's previous owners, but found that land transfers prior to Blackwood's acquisition had been removed from public archives. When she requested permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site, her request was denied by state authorities. Her research grant was unexpectedly cancelled 2 months later. The university cited budgetary constraints. In 1967, a former groundskeeper for the county park system came forward with an account that added another dimension to the mystery. Samuel Johnson had worked on the preliminary clearing of the Willowbrook site in 1947 before development was abandoned. According to Johnson, workers discovered a narrow tunnel leading from the remains of the wine cellar to a point nearly half a mile away, emerging in a small outbuilding near the river. That tunnel wasn't built by slaves, Johnson insisted in a recorded interview. The stonework was too precise, too old, and there were markings carved into the walls, symbols none of us recognized. Johnson claimed that photographs were taken of these markings before the tunnel entrance was sealed with concrete. When asked why development of the park was halted, Johnson said simply, "Some things ain't meant to be disturbed." The photographs Johnson mentioned have never surfaced in public records. His account might be dismissed as fantasy, if not for a curious notation in Judge Blackwood's personal expense ledger from 1820, preserved in a distant relative's collection. The entry, dated March 12th, records payment to a Professor H. Winters for translation services, ancient text found on property. No further explanation is provided, and no Professor Winters appears in any faculty records of institutions existing in South Carolina at that time. This suggests Blackwood discovered something unexpected on his property, something requiring scholarly interpretation. The timing coincides with the beginning of renovations to create the underground chambers, raising the possibility that Blackwood was not building something new, but modifying something ancient. But to what purpose? The illegal slave trade theory accounts for some aspects of the mystery, but fails to explain the apparent age of the original structure or why Blackwood would choose such an elaborate and risky hiding place when more conventional solutions were available to other smugglers. In 1821, Blackwood made a curious addition to his will, which was updated annually. He established a substantial trust fund for maintenance and security of the lower holdings at Willowbrook. The fund was to remain active even if the property changed hands. When the will was executed after his presumed death, this provision was struck by the probate court as contrary to public interest. No explanation for this decision appears in court records. What was Blackwood protecting, and from whom? His correspondence from this period reveals a man increasingly concerned with security. He hired additional overseers, installed elaborate locks imported from Europe, and kept detailed records of everyone who visited the property. Most telling was his purchase of 6 trained guard dogs in November 1822, just 2 months before the fire. The timing of Solomon's arrival at Willowbrook becomes increasingly significant when viewed in this context. Records show Blackwood made a specific request for a literate slave from Virginia, paying far above market value. This suggests Solomon was not purchased for conventional labor, but for some specialized purpose connected to whatever was happening beneath the mansion. In 1959, a professor of linguistics from Yale University visited Charleston to examine colonial-era documents for a research project. Among the materials he studied was a fragment of correspondence between Judge Blackwood and an unnamed colleague, discussing the text and its implications for established history. The professor noted the unusual nature of this exchange, but thought little of it until years later, when he encountered references to the Willowbrook case in an unrelated context. Intrigued, he attempted to locate the original document for further study, but discovered it had been removed from the archive. When he inquired about its whereabouts, he was informed that no such document had ever been catalogued. His notes on its contents remained the only evidence of its existence. Those notes included a curious phrase attributed to Blackwood: "If Solomon's translations are accurate, what we have found beneath Willowbrook predates any known settlement in the region." The implications are either fantastical or terrifying, depending on one's perspective. This suggests that Solomon's literacy was central to whatever Blackwood had discovered. Perhaps he was purchased specifically to translate or interpret something found in the underground chambers, something written in a language or script unfamiliar to Blackwood and his associates. The timing of events in late 1822 and early 1823 indicates a rapid escalation of some situation centered on Willowbrook. The purchase of guard dogs, the mysterious death of Esther, the urgent meeting of 8 business associates, and finally the fire that claimed their lives, all point to a crisis that reached its climax on January 15th. What if Solomon's act of vengeance was not merely for Esther's death, but a response to something far more profound? What if what he learned through his translations revealed something so disturbing about Blackwood's activities that he felt compelled to take drastic action? The journal, allegedly found in 1965, might have answered these questions, but like so many pieces of this puzzle, it vanished before it could be properly examined. The construction worker who discovered it, Joseph Miller, provided one additional detail in his 1979 interview that historians have struggled to interpret. According to Miller, the final entry contained a cryptic statement: "What sleeps below must never awaken. Better that this knowledge burn with them than spread beyond these walls." This suggests Solomon's actions may have been motivated not just by revenge, but by a desire to contain something, whether information or something more tangible, that he believed should remain hidden. The fire in this interpretation was not merely punitive, but preventative. In 1892, a surveyor named William Harrison documented unusual magnetic anomalies in the vicinity of the former Willowbrook estate. His equipment behaved erratically within a specific radius of the old foundation, a phenomenon he could not explain through any known geological features of the area. Harrison's report was filed with the county clerk, but was subsequently removed from public records. A notation in the catalogue states only, "Transferred to federal authorities by request." This federal interest in a seemingly minor geological curiosity is unusual, especially given that the property had been abandoned for nearly 70 years at that point. It suggests that whatever lay beneath Willowbrook continued to be of concern long after the mansion itself was reduced to ashes. In 1962, at the height of the Cold War, local residents reported unusual activity at the Willowbrook site. Government vehicles were observed coming and going for approximately 2 weeks. No public statement was made regarding their purpose, but rumors circulated that scientific equipment had been installed to monitor the property. When questioned, county officials claimed it was a routine environmental survey. A Freedom of Information request filed in 1993 revealed that the Department of Energy had indeed conducted tests at the site, though the nature of these tests was heavily redacted in the released documents. One unredacted section noted, "Consistent with previous findings from 1892 survey," a direct reference to Harrison's magnetic anomaly report from 70 years earlier. What would interest the Department of Energy in an abandoned plantation site? And why would they reference a 19th century survey that had supposedly been removed from public records? The connection suggests a continuity of knowledge and concern about Willowbrook that spans from Blackwood's time to the modern era. In 2003, during a particularly severe drought, subsidence occurred near the old Willowbrook Foundation. A portion of ground collapsed, revealing what appeared to be a stone archway approximately 15 feet below the current ground level. Before it could be properly documented, county officials cordoned off the area, citing safety concerns. The depression was filled with concrete within 48 hours. A geology student who briefly examined the site before it was sealed reported that the stonework appeared inconsistent with colonial or antebellum construction techniques. More puzzling was his observation that the visible portion of the arch contained symbols similar to those described by the groundskeeper Samuel Johnson in 1967, markings that resembled no known writing system. If these accounts are accurate, they suggest that whatever Judge Blackwood discovered beneath his property was neither of his making nor from his time. The elaborate underground chambers he commissioned may have been built not to create something new, but to contain or control something already present, something he believed valuable enough to protect with extraordinary security measures. This interpretation casts the events of January 1823 in an entirely new light. The meeting of 8 powerful men might not have been about illegal slave trading, but about this more unusual discovery. Perhaps they gathered to witness it, to decide its fate, or to exploit it in some way that history has yet to reveal. And Solomon, the literate slave purchased at great expense from Virginia, the man who allegedly burned 8 masters alive and was executed without trial. What was his true role in this narrative? Was he merely an instrument of Blackwood's will until he rebelled? Was he a translator who learned something so disturbing he felt compelled to take drastic action? Or was he, perhaps, the only one who truly understood what lay beneath Willowbrook and chose to contain it through fire? The mysterious letter found in his possession might have answered these questions, but like so many crucial pieces of this historical puzzle, it vanished into the deliberate obscurity that surrounds the entire case. In 1968, the same year that construction workers discovered the mass grave near Willowbrook, an elderly woman living in Boston donated a collection of family papers to a historical society. Among them was a diary belonging to her great-grandfather, who had served as an officer in the Union Army during the occupation of Charleston. One entry, dated July 1862, described a conversation with a local man who made a curious claim about Judge Blackwood. "The old Negro insists that the judge did not perish in the fire," the officer wrote. "Says he encountered Blackwood on the road to Savannah a week after the mansion burned. Claims the judge was accompanied by a slave, matching the description of the one they hanged for the crime." When pressed on this obvious impossibility, the man became agitated and would say no more. This account introduces an extraordinary possibility, that both Blackwood and Solomon somehow survived the events of January 1823. That they fled together suggests not enmity, but collaboration. If true, it upends every conventional interpretation of the Willowbrook case. Could the elaborate execution of a slave named Solomon have been staged? Historical records show the hanging was carried out quickly, with minimal witnesses, and the body was buried in an unmarked grave. If Blackwood had co-conspirators among local authorities, such a deception might have been possible. The theory that Judge Blackwood resurfaces as Thaddeus Black in New Orleans gains credibility in this scenario. Census records show that Black employed a personal secretary described as free-colored, who matched Solomon's general description. This individual, listed only as S. Johnson, remained in Black's household until 1839, when both men relocated to Boston. Boston church records from 1841 mention a donation from Thaddeus Black to establish a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation. The church's first deacon was Samuel Johnson, possibly the same S. Johnson from New Orleans. Johnson operated a small printing business specializing in legal documents and translations from French and Spanish. These fragments suggest the possibility of a shared escape, a new identity, and eventually a life of relative prosperity and freedom for both men. But what would unite a Virginia-born slave and a Carolina judge in such an unlikely alliance? What shared purpose or knowledge would compel them to fake their deaths and flee together? The answer may lie in what they discovered beneath Willowbrook, something they deemed necessary to conceal from Blackwood's associates, something worth burning a mansion to contain. In 1856, a package arrived at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., sent anonymously from Boston. It contained a small stone tablet covered in unfamiliar markings and a note that read simply, "From beneath Willowbrook Plantation, Charleston County, South Carolina." The only fragment that should ever see the light of day. The tablet was examined briefly by linguists who could make no sense of the markings, and by geologists who determined it was composed of stone not native to North America. It was catalogued as an artifact of unknown origin and purpose and placed in storage. During a reorganization of collections in 1891, the tablet was listed as missing. In 1957, a fire broke out in the Boston home of Catherine Blackwood, the last known descendant of Thaddeus Black. She perished in the blaze. Investigators noted that the fire appeared to have started in the basement, where neighbors reported she had been conducting historical research into her family origins. Among the few items recovered from the site was a metal box containing charred papers and a fragment of what appeared to be the same type of stone tablet sent to the Smithsonian a century earlier. The box and its contents were confiscated by federal authorities within hours of their discovery. No official explanation was ever provided for this action. These scattered pieces suggest a narrative spanning generations, a secret discovered, contained, hidden, and ultimately pursued, even by those who came long after. Whatever lay beneath Willowbrook was deemed important enough to kill for, to flee for, and to continue protecting decades after the original events. The land where Willowbrook once stood remains undeveloped, an empty space in an otherwise developed county. Local children are still warned away from the site, though few could explain exactly why. Occasional visitors report unusual equipment failure. Cameras malfunction, compasses spin erratically, and even modern GPS devices show inexplicable errors within the property boundaries. Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain buried, their traces deliberately obscured by those who understood the consequences of revelation. Perhaps Solomon and Judge Blackwood, unlikely allies in a mystery spanning centuries, made the right choice in containing whatever they found beneath that antebellum mansion. Or perhaps, as the mysterious Catherine Pembroke wrote in 1823, there was indeed a ninth figure moving through the darkness that January night, something wearing the judge's face but was not the judge at all, something that found a new vessel, a new identity, a new way to move through the world undetected. The story of Solomon and the 8 masters who burned at Willowbrook remains one of the South's most obscured historical mysteries, not because it has been forgotten, but because it has been actively erased. Each generation that rediscovers fragments of the truth seems to reach the same conclusion. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, and so the land remains empty, the chambers sealed, the truth buried beneath layers of concrete, conspiracy, and deliberate forgetting. The only testament to what happened there is the persistent unease that surrounds the property, a wordless warning passed down through generations, urging visitors to walk quickly past the overgrown foundation, to avoid asking too many questions about what might still lie beneath. In the archives of a small historical society in Massachusetts, there is a letter dated 1868, purportedly written by Samuel Johnson of Boston to an unnamed correspondent. The final paragraph reads, "You ask if I regret the actions taken that night in January. I can only say that some fires are necessary, not as acts of destruction, but of containment. What sleeps beneath those ashes must never awaken. Judge me as you will, but know that 8 souls was a small price to pay for the safety of countless others. May God forgive what I have done. May humanity never learn why I did it, whether this Samuel Johnson was indeed Solomon, whether he acted alone or in concert with Judge Blackwood, whether their motives were vengeance or something more profound. These questions may never find definitive answers. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself a final firewall, a last protection against knowledge that even history has deemed too dangerous to preserve. The site where Willowbrook once stood remains one of the few undeveloped parcels in an otherwise thriving county. It stands as a silent monument to secrets kept, to histories erased, and to questions that perhaps should remain unanswered. For in the case of Willowbrook and the slave who burned 8 masters alive, the absence of truth may be the greatest protection of all.